Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar in our workplace literacy series. We've titled it Organizational Needs Assessments, and we'll spend the majority of our time discussing ONAs. However, we'll also spend a bit of time talking about individual employee assessments as they often form part of an ONA. This morning, you'll be hearing from Robin Cook Ritchie. Robin, if you wouldn't mind just unmuting yourself and introducing yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, everybody. I'm Robin, and I am co-presenting this today with Tamara.
Thanks, Robin. And for those who don't know me, my name is Tamara Cottery. I'm the Executive Director of Literacy Link South Central, which is a regional literacy network based out of London. I'm sorry if I sound nasally today. I'm just getting over COVID and potentially a cold. I don't know if I think I had both or what's going on there, but my apologies if my voice sounds silly. So just a few housekeeping items. First, if you're not speaking or attempting to speak, please mute yourself so that we can reduce any background noise. Also, if you're not able to use your mic for some reason today, or if you're a little on the shy side and you prefer not to speak, please use the chat feature to express yourself and tell us what you're thinking. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the webinar and at points throughout. But if you need a question answered earlier than that, please either put your hand up or write your question in the chat and we'll be happy to address it. And just one other note is we are recording this. I'm sure you all know that by now, but not everybody can make themselves available for webinars. So we wanted to have it available for those who couldn't make it today. Okay, so Robin, next, thanks. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is on organizational needs assessments, which is quite a mouthful. So we will be referring to organizational needs assessments as ONAs. We could also call them workplace needs assessments or employer needs assessments, since we're talking about working with employers. During an ONA, we look at broad skills needs that may be affecting a workplace. Once those needs have been identified, though, you may need to develop an understanding of where individual employee skills are at. And so we've also included some information today on individual needs assessments. And in this case, the individuals in question are employees. You may recall that for each webinar in this workplace literacy training series, there's also a corresponding community of practice. The community of practice meeting will happen a couple of weeks from now. We included this element because we live in the age of the webinar. People carve an hour or two out of their busy schedules to learn about a particular topic, and then they're often required to move on to the next topic, crisis or opportunity. We deliberately wanted to create time and space for each of you to return to the topic of ONAs and think a bit more about how to apply what you will have learned today. At points during today's webinar, you'll see some additional questions that Robin and I have posed, and these are questions that we'll revisit again 2 weeks from now. The first webinar in this series was on marketing, and today's is on assessment. Our third webinar in this series will be about training, or actually delivering training in a workplace, and the final webinar will be about evaluation. While we're presenting these topics separately, the reality is that they often entwine with each other. You may find that there are opportunities for marketing that extend beyond your initial discussions and ONA development with an employer. The relationship between an LBS provider and an employer presents an opportunity for ongoing learning. As an employer learns more about what LBS programming can do, and if the employer has a positive experience, which we hope they will, then you may find they're able to market in an ongoing manner as new or additional needs are discovered or as new employees are hired. There's also a strong tie between today's module on assessment and the final evaluation module. You can't build training if you don't know what you want participants to get out of it. And you won't know if they got what you wanted them to get out of it unless you think about how you're going to evaluate it. An organizational needs assessment is a natural follow-up to a successful LBS marketing campaign for the workplace. Getting employer buy-in for training is crucial. And while I just used the word campaign, I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. A campaign? Who has time to launch a campaign? But remember, a campaign can be with a single employer. Okay. Another point we wanted to make at the outset of this webinar is that LBS will not and does not need to have all the answers to employer training needs. We as LBS networks can assist in brokering other groups to provide support. For example, Literacy Link South Central, the organization that I work for, is currently working with an employer who wants basic communication skills training for employees. That's LBS. But this same employer also has a significant group of employees for whom ESL is a need. In this case, Literacy Link will reach out to groups that provide ESL information and training. A workplace needs assessment can assist in identifying the original training needs of the employer. I say original because as conversations, training, and time go on, new needs may be discovered. We recognize this daily with learners in our LBS programs, and it's the same in workplaces. So let's take a look. One of our colleagues who has a lot of experience in workplace literacy, Doug Noyes from Literacy Link Eastern Ontario. Doug, do you want to give a wave? There he is. Okay. Has often noted that LBS practitioners have a tendency to sell themselves short. They may believe that they don't have the skills they need to deliver workplace literacy. This slide is designed to show that most, if not all, LBS programs already have most of the skills they'll need. They'll just be delivering with a twist. LBS practitioners already know how to support others in setting goals. In an LBS program, they support learners. In the workplace, they will support the employer, as well as employees, of course, not instead of. LBS practitioners are accustomed to getting referrals from other organizations. When it comes to workplace literacy, the referrals come from a particular workplace. Assessment happens in both arenas and training is delivered in both arenas. In our day-to-day lives, we spend some of our time reporting to the Ministry of Labor, Immigration Training, and Skills Development. In workplace literacy, our main accountability is to the employer. The good news here is that employers usually don't have a lot of demands when it comes to reporting. And just as surely as we would evaluate within our LBS programs, both learner progress and the overall success of programming, so too will we apply the same principles in the workplace. Just going to pause there for a moment to see if anybody has any comments about that. Agreement, disagreement?
We do have one question from the audience, and that is it's a more of a logistical question. Will we get the slides after? It would save me lots of time writing notes.
Great point. We don't want people getting writer's cramp. So if you're on our list of people who registered for this training session, I will be sending out the slide deck along with the invitation to the upcoming community of practice. Okay, so in your case, Rita, since you may or may not be on the list, I think you actually did register. Oh, I think you asked the question. Okay, so if you don't get it later on today or tomorrow at the latest, then please email me directly because it means you fell through the cracks and we apologize for that, but sometimes it does happen, okay? All right, so I think now we want to go to a poll, but not a technical poll where you have to press anything. So we'd like to see actually by a show of hands, how many of you have conducted an organizational needs assessment before? So if you have, you can put up your hand or put up a green check mark or yeah, oh, there we go. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now remember, if you're not showing us your beautiful face today and you're raising your physical hand, we're not going to be able to see that. So, okay. So it looks like we have 4 or 5 people, if I'm looking at that correctly. Goodness, I have to scroll through all the screens here. Okay. So now I'd like to know of those who have conducted, if you wouldn't mind putting your hand down, if you have conducted an ONA, was it a positive experience, would you say? And if it was, then give me a thumbs up or, you can also raise your hand again. I'm not going to be too technical about this. Okay, so a couple people, not all the same people, I wouldn't say, who originally said they conducted a needs assessment. So maybe just a moment here to share, if it didn't go well, why do you think it didn't go well? And if it did go well, why do you think it did go well? And I'm going to need you to raise your hand for me if you don't mind. So Doug, I think your hand is up if you wouldn't mind.
Thanks, Tamara. Yeah, I've had experiences that went well and experiences that did not go well. So I thought I'll chime in about both. The one that went well, the employer was sold right off the bat about what we could bring to their workplace. And so it was not a huge sell to them. And once we were started talking, the employer came up with all sorts of other things that we could help them with. I think we could be working there for 2 or 3 years.
Mm.
On the flip side, I went out and did a couple of O&As with a couple of other employers, and they were happy, they were keen, they really wanted us to come in and help them out and that sort of stuff. But they decided before we started the training that now was not the right time. So one of them said, well, you know, we're still reeling from the effects of COVID. We have more work to be done and not enough staff, so we can't really take people off the line to go for training. The other group said, yeah, we're really excited to have you come in and do that. Unfortunately, this was a workplace that is, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not sure, who's about to unionize. And when a union decides that they're going to come into a plant, the employees will stop doing anything that the management wants until the union comes in. So there are some things that are completely beyond our control as LBS organizational needs assessors, but just be aware that you don't always hit a home run.
Thanks, Doug. I mean, and that's something I think we all need to be reminded of. It certainly mirrors some of the experiences we've had here at Literacy Link South Central. We had one group that we were talking about, you know, at the preliminary stages of doing an organizational needs assessment. And then they went and more power to them. They merged with another large company, right? So of course that's going to take precedence over everything else, right? So in those cases, we have to sort of sit back and wait, which is kind of difficult when we have timelines that we have to deal with and expectations and targets and all that kind of fun stuff. But they simply will not be moved, right? Because they have to deal with their business first. So thanks for sharing that, Doug. Shelley, your hand's up.
Hi, good morning. So one of ours was kind of a joint, it was a joint ESL and LBS group, and it was a company that's just outside of St. Thomas. So the need was there, and they were like, please come in. We have some, you know, interpretation needs for Spanish, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, we spoke about the breadth things that we could do and what exactly were they interested in. And so, you know, on paper, it looked like they had some things that we wanted. Once we got out there, you know, we were called out sort of on a quick, could you come and support us this afternoon? We have a group meeting. It'd be a great chance for you to see the group. And then the owners and the managers were speaking to the people, the workers, we realized we were just simply there for interpretation. And they were not speaking respectfully to their staff. And it just turned sour very quickly. So they were asking us to give bad news and asking us to do that sort of thing. So the training piece, you know, even in follow-up, because we thought, okay, this is really important. We really need to help these employees. And the follow-up after that was they just ignored us completely.
Oh my God.
You know, there's a few calls and there's a, you know, a little bit of follow-up, but yeah, the idea of the actual training wasn't there anymore. They got what they wanted and decided that, you know, the training wasn't really that important to them after all. So, you know, you think you're stepping into a partnership. There was a lot more discussion. There was, you know, we thought that there was going to be some good things in empowerment and all of that, but it wasn't at all. They had their own needs, and they sort of pushed us into that corner and then dropped us. So.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Shelley. And I guess the only way to deal with a situation like that is to get out of it as quickly as possible, right? So you don't get a negative perception in the community. So, wow.
Yeah. So no, you know, try to understand the corporate culture is what we learned. So yeah.
So maybe in another situation, you might spend a little bit more time up front trying to understand the corporate culture before you actually went in and started providing any kind of service.
Yeah, so listening to the needs, like in hindsight, when we were listening to the needs were strongly communication, and we got that. But the other needs of just, you know, improving all the other skills, that was like, yeah, we'd like that too. So, you know, just really balancing that out would have been a better idea. That was
Thank you very
6,
much.
7 years ago. So
Well, hopefully it won't be repeated, but thanks for
that's
sharing
right.
that along with a potential, you know, a lesson learned, right? So
speakers.
if anybody
The
is not,
sound is
okay, I'm just muting people for where we might be getting some background noise. So, okay, next up, Anne Marie.
Hi, it's Anne Marie from Literacy Link South Central. And as you know, we have a workplace literacy project here. And so we have had opportunity to do the ONAs. And my experience so far is that they've been very successful and I've learned a great deal. And I do reinforce what Shelley said. You do need to know the corporate culture. I think our success was due to preparing ourselves. I did an essential skills profile before going in to sort of get a understanding of the work as much as possible, looked it up on the website, understood who they're connected with, what their work is. But it is a continual conversation. You come in, their priority is not our priority. And so it is tapping into their priority. And now retention and attraction is a huge priority for employers. So to be able to keep the focus on that and how we can help them do that really helped them to understand what we're trying to achieve as a partner with them in making our businesses and our community successful. I had to really, I'll say but it's we, of course. So we have a team at Literacy Link South Central, and Jeremy and I have done a lot of work on this, but continually make sure that you're using their language, not ours. So even organizational needs assessment is probably not something that I would use with the employer. I'd say, let's continue the conversation around your needs to further define what you want. Those kinds of things, because, it's just, again, just like anything, when you're creating materials and when you're talking to somebody, that you want to sort of find where you two meet and have that conversation. And so it takes a lot of prior thinking, but the more we do it, the more I'm learning about how to do it. And it's really interesting. And then just before I sign off, I want to report back to Tamara that I'll be meeting with that company that she spoke of that merged and was too busy next week, because they now have identified what skills they'd like us to help them with. So happy ending, but it is definitely, again, our priority, and our timelines are not their priority or in their timelines. So it's really quite it is a relationship that you build, and thinking that it's not that one-time contact, go in, do it, leave. It is maybe several calls. We've done an initial visit before we even did sort of even a more formal assessment to get a lay of the land of the organization and what their overall needs are. And that further helped us to have a more focused conversation when we went in to do the organizational needs assessment. So anyway, lots of lessons. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne Marie. So, again, the reality is it's not a one and done. You don't have a quick 30-second conversation and walk away with everything that you need for an ONA. And there may be pauses in there, right? So for those folks who are with us today because they have to conduct some organizational needs assessments between now and the end of March, probably better not to start March the 1st, right? Because we'd love to get it all done in a month, but chances are it's going to take a longer period of time. Tracy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just to contribute to the conversation and similar to Shelley's example, unfortunately, I've had a few employers, and when we get through this process, it seemed like they were on board, but as the process continued in learning their culture, all of the examples I have wanted our assistants off shift. So if we were going to be on helping their people, it would be on the people's time. They might provide us a space, but they could be working a 12-hour shift and want us to come for hour 13 to work with the folks. They didn't want it interrupting their business.
Mm.
And the only example I have is one fellow that that was fairly positive, an apprenticeship type situation. The employer was dedicating an hour or two, but then we found out later he was having to catch up his work by giving us the time to assist him in getting what they needed. Anyway, unfortunately, it wasn't a positive experience in any of the examples I have.
Oh, sorry to hear that, Tracy. And you're right. Those are sort of some of the seeds that can start to tell you whether or not a learning culture is in place, or where a company may be at, right? I mean, if they're not really integrating learning within their workplace, and it's understandable, I guess, to an extent why some people don't, because they're just not aware of some of these good practices or best practices. I guess in our favor right now is the fact that the labor market is so constricted, right? So employers who might normally not be willing to give in those departments may find that they have no other choice, if they want to retain staff. But that takes a long time for that pendulum to shift. So thanks for sharing. I think it's important for us to hear what works and what doesn't work, right? And what people's experiences have been. Heather, please go ahead.
Thanks. The experience I'm talking about took place prior to COVID. So, I mean, obviously there was less emphasis on digital and online then, but similar circumstances to what Tracy alluded to, except that there was really good buy-in from the employer. They did give staff time during their shift to attend, and it started out really well. And there were a large number of employees that were participating. And then they got a contract. The contract meant that they were overwhelmed with work, which all of a sudden then impacted on the amount of time they were able to give people to attend. And some chose to still pursue it off hours, but we did lose quite a number. I would still say it was a positive experience. It taught us that you really have to be very flexible in your delivery and very respectful and accommodating of the employer. In this particular case, as I said, the employer was really supportive of it. Just things kind of got out of their control as well, and they had to pull on their workforce to do more hours. So, but overall it was a good experience, and those that did continue with it were able to move up in the company, and so that said, it was a good experience.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks very much for sharing. There's so many layers to workplace training, right? But I think one of the things that you're hopefully going to take away today is the need for flexibility, right? I mean, as Doug started off by saying, there are only so many things that are within our control. But even when things aren't going, maybe 100%, we still know that some people are benefiting, right? Which is really a positive thing. Okay, so thanks everybody for sharing your experiences there. And now I'm going to turn it over to Robin.
Samara. So we're going to just talk a little bit about the process and all the different components that could be involved in an organizational needs assessment now. The process of conducting an organizational needs assessment, or an ONA, it's not a set process. It probably won't be linear, even if you set out with that intention. So you're going to have a plan, but what the plan actually, the route the plan goes, you're not going to know what's going to happen at the beginning when you start. An ONA could include meetings, tours, interviews, conversations, correspondence. There's all different things that can happen in this process. And I think all the feedback we just heard from people who have participated in ONAs before was really helpful and reinforces this whole concept of there's lots of different things that need to happen, but you have to be flexible in your approach and kind of respond to the needs of the employer. Every organization that you deal with is going to have a different approach. They're going to have a different way of doing things, and they're going to have a different level of knowledge. So again, that means it's going to make you have to be very flexible, which we are fantastic at as literacy practitioners as you work through the process. So the steps we're going to walk you through today are meant to provide some guidance only. In some cases, you're not going to do all the steps. In other cases, you might do them in a different order. So it's kind of a menu of different things that you should consider as you go through the process. Generally speaking, there are a few things that you really should look at. So you need to learn about the company. You need to obviously determine what the needs of the employer are. That's a big one, and it happens throughout the process. You need to find out if the company has had any past experiences with training or training programs, because that can help you. You need to be able to sell what workplace training can do for the employer, and also what it can't do. So you have to balance that and not overcommit or overpromise. You do need to have that hard conversation about the literacy word with the employer and what it really means, and talk about it in terms of the connection to the wide variety of skills that people need to be able to be successful in the workplace. Clarifying employer expectations. Again, we've got this kind of in this process, but that's something that you need to constantly do as you're working through the process itself. It's going to probably happen a few different times. You're going to need at some point to really do an in-depth gap analysis. You're going to have to figure out what they need and where the actual gaps are, because that's what the training, that's the foundation of building the training that you're going to provide. You're going to determine training options that can be provided or that can be accessed. So remember, you might not be able to do everything, but we work in communities, and sometimes you can draw from your community of other supports to actually pull in other people to help with training, or direct the employer to other sources of training if that's what makes the most sense. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about preparing that organizational needs assessment report or document or letter or whatever it looks like, because you're going to want to put something down in writing at some point that kind of outlines what's happened, what the training is going to look like, and what it is that you're going to do. So as we move through the rest of the webinar, we're going to expand on each of these different areas and just talk a little bit more about each of them.
Okay, so here we
Before-
have the first of several reality checks. Sorry, Robin, did I cut you off? I thought I heard somebody
I'm good.
talking there. Okay. I can't really emphasize this first point enough. Don't expect the employer to know a lot about literacy and basic skills, or even education in general. They don't eat, sleep, and breathe learning outcomes, complexity levels, or essential skills for success. Try not to speak LBS. Speak solutions that they can understand with examples of what you can do. And we talked a lot about this in our marketing webinar. They've probably identified issues within their workplace, but they'll be looking to you for the potential solutions. And you know this stuff. Listen to what the employer is saying, guide them with open-ended questions to try to get as much information as possible, and then propose examples of training that might meet their needs. And as I mentioned earlier, most of all, be flexible to their needs as you move through the process. A couple of years ago, I was arranging one-on-one conversations with employers about skills needs within their companies. And at least one out of every two employers canceled on me at least once, usually at the last minute, because that's the kind of world that they live in. I mean, if we all did that to each other, we'd be appalled. Like every now and then we have to cancel a meeting or whatever, but that's not kind of the reality that we're accustomed to. So just to circle back to the employers and LBS talk different languages piece, currently Literacy Link South Central is working with an employer that has a lot of employees for whom English is their second language. So we invited an organization to come in and speak to the employees about local ESL skill building opportunities. And the ESL organization wanted to know what the employer's assessment protocol was. I'm quite certain the employer in question does not have an assessment protocol, or even an assessment for that matter. They're just at the beginning stages of looking at employees' ESL needs. I'm not saying that an employer could not or should not have an assessment protocol. I'm just saying that most won't. And they won't have any idea what you're talking about if you ask them questions like that. So, as I mentioned before, it's a learning process, both for the LBS agencies and for the employer. One of the employers we're working with does all kinds of stuff with hydraulics. I could write what I know about hydraulics on the head of a pin, right? So, there's a lot that I need to learn in order to fully understand. Well, not fully, because that's probably not possible, but in order for me to have a good enough understanding of what that company is trying to do, right? So, it's definitely a two-way street. Over to you, Robin.
So one of the first things you should probably do, and Anne-Marie actually spoke about this when she was giving her example, is spend some time learning about the company you're going to work with. Kind of like if you're looking for a job and you land an interview, you should show up having put in the effort to learn about the company. It's going to go a long way in terms of establishing your professionalism. And frankly, it's going to save you a lot of time up front. Before you meet, research the company or organization online. Try to find out what it is that they actually do, a little bit about their history, what positions you think exist there or do exist there, and what general jobs does it seem that employees do. You could even go one step further. And again, Anne-Marie mentioned this and talked about looking at essential skills profiles. They're a little hard to find right now, but if you look on the job bank, you can actually access those profiles still. So if you can figure out what some of the positions are, you can go to the job bank, look them up, and actually read through what some of the skills are according to that. Now, keep in mind what somebody actually does on the job and what's in the essential skills profile might actually differ, even though they have the same title, but it's a good place to start just so that you have a little bit of knowledge going in. When you actually get the chance to meet with an employer, you're going to have saved a lot of time by getting that background information under your belt. You can also then use your time with the employer a lot more efficiently to clarify your knowledge and fill in the gaps. Ask questions. You might be able to request a tour if that seems reasonable within the organization. But keep in mind that isn't always a possibility because a lot of organizations don't allow people into their facilities for safety reasons, for security reasons. There's all sorts of reasons that might not be a possibility. But also when you're talking to the employee, see if it's going to be possible to talk to different levels of employees for gathering information during that analysis process. So it's really important to hear what management says, but if you can get the opportunity to talk to the other levels within the organization, you're going to be able to get more information about what's needed and what the gaps are. Determining the needs of the employee is a big piece of the pie. It's probably the biggest piece of the puzzle. I could be wrong, but I'm guessing it is. It's key because it's going to form the foundation of what happens going forward. It's important when you're trying to gather this information that you kind of start with broad-based or open-ended questions to determine what they think is needed. You need to find out what problems they're trying to solve. You need to ask them to identify areas where they have concerns within the company. If there weren't any issues or problems, then they wouldn't be looking for training, or they won't think they need training. So, but it's important to try to get that information out with open-ended questions first. Give them an opportunity to tell you. Don't make assumptions. Don't assume you know what the problems are. It might be a bit hard to do that, though. Sometimes those conversations don't go as easy as you think they're going to go. So you can use as a strategy giving examples of areas that might benefit from training. So, you could suggest those areas if you're trying to elicit information like the hiring process, orientation and onboarding, using mandatory documents in the workplace like policies, health and safety procedures, WMIS documents, what daily tasks are, such as like daily tasks that involve skills like using training manuals, operating procedures, what kind of math related activities do people have to do. You can also say that, training can be a benefit to employee interactions around communication and teamwork. And it can also be just for personal development and support and the development of skills which then become transferable to the workplace. For example, financial literacy. There's lots of different things that you could suggest. Can you think of any others? If you can think of any others, feel free to share them in the chat as we're kind of talking about this. You need to actually talk to them about what success looks like from their perspective. So what is it they're trying to accomplish by bringing in training from the outside? What is the result, or in kind of academic language, the outcome that the company's looking for? Like what is the end result to all of this? And how do they think training is going to contribute to that outcome? So there's lots of, again, this is a big piece of the puzzle. There's lots of different things that you're going to do in order to determine employer needs, but it probably will start with a conversation that you have with them initially. Okay, I didn't see any comments, but as we're going through, if you think of other areas, suggested areas, feel free to put them in the chat. So,
Okay, so we felt that it was important to address the whole idea of unions. If there's a union at a workplace that you have approached or that has approached you, it's really important for them to be involved from the beginning. That's why we put this slide here at the beginning when you're just working to determine what an employer's needs are. And if you needed any more convincing on this point, you probably only have to think about what's been in the news for the past week or so as far as unions go. So instead of me just telling you why it's important to have a union on board, why do you think it's important to have a union on board in a workplace literacy setting? Anybody have any ideas? I think somebody has an idea. Tracy?
I'm just thinking, if you're union on board, you have to be cognizant of their collective agreement and what impacts that it has on the contract that they have.
hmm Yeah, certainly going back to some of the conversations about hours and what hours are expected to be paid or volunteered, for sure. Thank you. Doug?
There are certain unions that really help us. CUPE is one. So if you go into a workplace where CUPE's there, they've developed so many adult upgrading resources, et cetera, et cetera. You've got a partner right there. I also think that when I've gone into a unionized workplace, I want to go in and talk with the employer and tell the employer, hey, you're the boss here. You decide what's going to happen. And then when I go talk with the union president, I tell them the same thing. Because I want them to both feel like they have equal power. Because I think that's important within the relationship between a union and management. I just throw that out there. Could be, might work, might not. But anyway, there you go.
Well, the union is an incredibly important partner, right? So to not have their buy-in, to not have their sort of support can have some very negative consequences. Heather?
Yeah, I'm just looking at it from a different perspective. If the union is on board, the unions are usually perceived by the employees as being in their best interest. So it may provide an added incentive for them to participate in any programming or upgrading that takes place.
Absolutely. Any other comments about unions and why you would want to make sure that if there's a union within that workplace, that they are actively consulted and involved? Here's a couple things, or here are a couple things I came up with. So a union will want to be sure that the training or assessment that is brought into the organization is not being used as a screening or weeding tool to get rid of employees who have lower levels of skills, right? So you don't want any efforts that you bring in related to training to be perceived as potentially punitive or as a way to get rid of people who are not performing. That kind of language should not go over well and does not go over well with unions. And also, as you were saying, Heather, unions have clout. I mean, their members listen. If a union is not supportive of a training opportunity, it can be the end of it. If they are, they can be an excellent partner in creating and delivering messaging about the value of training, both for work purposes and for personal growth. And Doug, your example about CUPE, I mean, if a union's gone to the lengths of developing their own adult learning materials, you know that they get it, right? You know that they're on board and they're going to do a darn good job of making sure that their employees hear about any opportunities that you bring in. Okay. So we're going to take a pause here to think about evaluation, and not just because I like evaluation. If anybody knows me, they know I'm a little bit of a nerd in this department. But as I mentioned earlier, the 4 topics that we're covering in our workplace literacy series are often entwined. So setting realistic and achievable goals is paramount. It's a really important part of the ONA. You don't want an employer, this is going to be a pretty specific and lengthy example, so prepare yourself. So you don't want an employer to think that after offering 16 to 20 hours of training, that the group of Nepalese workers who are currently at a Canadian language benchmark of 4 or 5 will suddenly be able to read and understand the 200-page employee handbook. Okay. Some of the literature on workplace literacy and on organizational needs assessments may talk about pre and post assessments of learning and about skill levels that employees have mastered or haven't. Employers might say that they want to become involved in workplace literacy because they want to see their rates of absenteeism go down and productivity increase. So we have to be careful to talk about goals that may be observed through the training that LBS delivers. On the other side of the fence, you're probably going to want to know more than whether or not employees like the training. Here, it's important to take some time to define what's actually possible. For example, in the previous example I gave you about the Nepalese workers, you might not be able to get them to fully read and understand the employee handbook, but you might be able to excite them about learning, connect them to further learning opportunities in the community, and increase their feelings of loyalty to the company. Loyalty equals retention, and employers care very much about retention, particularly in this labor market. And even though the learning that you offer will most likely be contextualized to the workplace, don't forget to explore the benefits that may accrue to employees and other non-work aspects of their lives. Hey, Robin. Robin, are you there?
I'm trying to be quiet in the background and I keep turning my mic off and then I forget to turn it back on, but we flip back and forth a lot. So I'm going to talk about past experiences, reviewing past experiences. But before we do that, I just want to go back to the chat for a minute to share some comments that were made on the last couple of slides that we shared. So when I was speaking a couple of slides ago, Doug mentioned gathering authentic workplace documents and scenarios. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we move through the process. It's important, and it's something that when you're talking to the employer, that's your opportunity to try to gather that information. And Anne-Marie shared that their employer said they wanted to know what the impact of training would be. They listed learning outcomes contextualized within the workplace. So I think Tamara's going to talk a little bit more about that later. And she also mentioned that they talk about future proofing of employees. So in terms of giving them ideas about areas where training could actually be of benefit, sometimes employees don't necessarily the employer doesn't think the employee needs to build certain skills. So they use the concept of future proofing. So they might not need the skills right now at work, but in the future, they may need them, or they may need them out in the world. And then Jeremy commented on the union discussion and said, I think you want to make sure that you don't introduce training that the union already provides in some form to their members through the partnership with their employer. So that's also a really good point. Okay, so sorry, I didn't want to lose those comments before we moved on. So in terms of past experiences, you should really try to find out what training has been done in the past and how it went. They might not have any past experiences with training though, so that's also probably going to be a reality in a lot of cases, and that's okay. Many companies that have training in place focus on training for management. It seems a lot more common for companies to think that management requires training opportunities, but they don't necessarily look at all the different levels within an organization. Many companies that have training in place really do focus on that. So what you need to do is to try to find out what the employer values in training, what successful training might look like. But while you're talking to them, listen for key statements of what not to do. So I wouldn't necessarily ask them, what shouldn't we do? But as you're listening to the information, try to pull that out in your own mind so that you know things that maybe they're alluding to as being unsuccessful, but might not overtly or explicitly be telling you. Use questions to guide the conversation. Questions like, tell us about past training programs you implemented that were successful. Try to find out what made those programs worthwhile at the company, what made them successful. Ask, were there past training programs that you considered unsuccessful? Dig for details on why they think the training might not have worked out for them or didn't accomplish what they wanted it to do. And also, how receptive are staff to training? So this is really part of that whole workplace culture and whether or not workplaces really support training. Staff are going to be less receptive to something if they're not supported by their employer. Find out if professional development is an ongoing part of their workplace culture. And based on the information that you gather, whether the training that you're planning on working on developing with that employer is going to be a hard sell or not. So it's important to kind of have that in your back pocket and understand what you're going into. Not everybody is going to want to participate in training, especially mandatory training. We know that. We experience that in LBS all the time, and we're very, very, very good at not selling training, but presenting training in a way that people can see benefit in it. So I think we have a lot of skills around that, and these skills can be definitely transferable in a workplace environment if you're experiencing some resistance. So another important thing is to really explain what makes us, literacy and basic skills providers, different than other training programs. You might want to talk about or share that we can be very flexible in the training that we can offer, that the training we provide can address different things. We can do core skills, functional skills, essential skills related to the workplace, and also skills that support personal achievement. You might want to share some examples of the type of training that can be provided, but try to relate this back to what you've heard from the company so far and what their needs are so far. So it's an opportunity to sell yourself, but always try to relate it back to what you're hearing from the company. One thing you need to be very careful about is that whether or not you have the ability to provide any technical skills training. So typically we don't do that type of training. And when I'm talking about technical skills training, because we use different terms for different things in different ways all the time in literacy. What I'm talking about are, how to use a particular machine or how to do advanced bookkeeping. Those are not really within our wheelhouse or the realm of what we do in LBS typically. So you have to be cautious about that and be upfront about what the limitations are and what our role is. Remember, even if you haven't ever specifically delivered training in the workplace, you've probably delivered training to support employment goals. In fact, I guarantee that you've done that because it's one of the 5 things that we serve. So you have experience doing this, you have the skills to do it, you just have to transfer them to a completely different environment. And that's important to remember though, like have confidence in the fact that we've been working on this. We have a lot of this already developed. We just have to make that leap into the workplace. And to use that job interview analogy again, it's like when you're in a job interview, you got to sell yourself based on your transferable skills. So even if you haven't ever done workplace training in a workplace before, you have the skills to do it. So sell those transferable skills. Okay, we're going to try to do an interactive activity now, which we practiced earlier today. So I'm calling us out on our digital literacy skills right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a whiteboard activity, and hopefully you participate. We're going to take a minute and a breather from listening to us talk. We're going to pull up a whiteboard and we'll see how that goes. And we're going to get everybody in the audience to try to participate in the whiteboard activity. So what we want you to do is add some thoughts about the following questions. What types of workplace training might be popular in your community? Just based on your knowledge of industries that are out there or conversations you might have already had. What in-house resources do you have already that you think you could use or modify? If you have any, you might not. And if you don't have resources, where can you find them? Where might you go to find resources to support workplace training? Okay, so those are the questions you're answering. If we have a complete and utter fail with the whiteboard, or you're just not comfortable using it, then we'll just revert to putting it in the chat box, okay? So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here and I'm gonna pull a whiteboard up. Okay, can everybody see the whiteboard?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so have at it. You can just try to post some information. We'll save the whiteboard afterwards as the PDF, so we have the information. And we have success. People are actually typing on the whiteboard.
See, if you build it, they will come, Robin. So there you go. So just to reiterate the questions, what types of workplace training might be popular in your community? What in-house resources do you have that you could use or modify? And if you don't have any resources, or if you need some additional resources, where do you think you might find them to support workplace training? I like the person who's drawing. That's cool. So I see a lot of digital. Oh, and people are using check marks. Nicely done. So if you like what somebody else has said, throw on a check mark.
We'll just give people another minute to share and then we'll try to
Summarize.
break this down. Yeah, I was trying to come up with the right word to use. And then we will try to.
There's no try, there's only do. We'll take our cues from
Is
Yoda.
only do. Yep.
I'm gonna add something.
Okay, Jeremy just made a comment, heard cats. I think that's in response to this whiteboard activity.
That's exactly it. You were looking for the right way to describe it. And I thought, you know what, this looks like herding
Yeah.
cats.
Yeah. I like it. Okay, I'm just gonna start sharing some of the things that are jumping out at me. Digital skills will likely be popular, especially file sharing and cloud-based apps. Sure, that's a big thing right now. And more workplaces are becoming more and more digitized, especially during and post COVID, even though we're not really post COVID. French language training, customer service is mentioned a few times. Interesting. I just did an analysis of the labor market information from the Ontario labor market site across the 5 different regions, and they actually produce a list of the top 15 in-demand jobs and the top 15 jobs 5 years out. So I actually made a table with all of those jobs and then I color coded it. If you know me for a long time, you know that I really love to make tables and I really love to color code them. And just to see, some of the trends and see where the focus can be for some of the development going forward. And customer service still appears, like that's still a big one. So here's some other ones: point of sale training, digital skills, basic math skills, working with local employment services to co-design or co-facilitate. That's an interesting way to go as well. So if you have a local employment service agency, that's a great partner in all of this. Could you, yes, Anne-Marie just asked, could you please share that chart with us, Robin? Yes, Anne-Marie, I will share it with, I'm going to share it through the Skills for Success community of practice. That's what I did it for. Okay, so manufacturing, lots of manufacturing, document use and forms, managing stress, supporting well-being. So there's all sorts of, there's a big range of skills. One thing I like that I see on here for finding resources is find LBS, find on LBS resources and discussion forums. So that is a site that CLO and LLO have put together over the past 5 years, where we're collecting all the resources that are out there and they're categorized. That's a good place to go for kind of, you know, curriculum that's been put together that you can use as a starting point. Because again, remember, probably anything we have isn't going to be an exact fit for whatever organization you're working with. You're going to have to really modify and adapt things to meet their particular needs, but there is a lot of stuff out there that you can start with. Okay. Discuss with your literacy service planning group. That's a really important one too, I think. And this is a great opportunity to do that in light of all of the initiatives that are going on right now. Did you want to talk a bit about that, Tamara?
Which initiatives, Robin? Sorry.
Oh, just in general, discussing with your literacy service planning group and the importance of that.
Oh, well, yeah, sorry, I'm connecting the dots here. So because workplace literacy is one of the 4 buckets under Skills for Success, hopefully you've heard about that, and it will be a topic of conversation at literacy service planning meetings, more so than it's ever been before, right? So your ability, your readiness, not to say that you have to be involved in workplace literacy, but chances are if you're on today's session, you're at least thinking about it if you're not already fully immersed in it. So I think making sure that workplace literacy has some element of coordination across the community is something that our ministry is looking for, but also something that's very helpful. One thing we repeatedly hear about working with employers is that their time is very limited. They don't want to be approached by 7 different agencies in the community, right? So it really does behoove us to, I can't believe I used the word behoove. It's really good for us to, think about how we can streamline that process so that we're not inadvertently annoying employers, by having multiple people reach out to them. I just wanted to thank Sarah for making sure that we had the link to the LBS resource forum, which is awesome. And Doug also noted in the chat occupational curricula. It's funny how that didn't really rise to the top, but I mean, it kind of did under customer service, I guess. But yeah, let's not forget that the adult literacy field, and Leo in particular, has done a lot of great work in developing occupational curricula. And depending on the employer, we were doing some work with Landscape Ontario last year. And lo and behold, count on LBS to sort of rise to the challenge. There had already been curriculum developed specifically for horticulture, working with plants, landscaping. And, in that case, the employer, Landscape Ontario, they were amazed that that stuff had all been developed and contextualized. So
Okay, I'm going to close out the whiteboard now, and we're going to go back into presentation mode. I did save the whiteboard, so hopefully we'll be able to share that as well.
thanks, Robin.
No problem. Hey, can you see the presentation? Are we good to go?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so at the beginning of the webinar, Tamara mentioned the community of practice that's going to take place on November 22nd. So again, this training was built in webinars, our standard mode of disseminating information in this field at this point. But with that piece put on, that community of practice piece where people come back and actually have an opportunity to to reflect on the information that they've learned. We don't ever get to do that. We're always just trying to get through the day and do as much as we can, but this is an opportunity to come back and think about what we've talked about today. So we did put some questions together just to try to guide that discussion, and they're shared again at the end of the presentation. But again, they'll just help us guide the conversation. So the two additional questions we've added here are: what makes LBS a good fit for workplace training? And how are we different from other training programs? So just think about that over the next few weeks. And if you come back and meet with us, we'll talk a little bit about that.
So up until now, we've been very free with our use of the L word, literacy, but that's because Robin and I know our audience. We're talking to LBS professionals, so we feel comfortable using the word literacy. We know that we're talking about much more than just reading and writing or literacy versus illiteracy. But can we make this assumption about employers? You might come in contact with employers who fully understand all that the word literacy encompasses, but the chances are slim. In our experience, it's worth having a conversation about how the word literacy might be perceived. As I mentioned, Literacy Link South Central has a current workplace literacy project that we're working on with Literacy Link Eastern Ontario that is funded through the Skills Development Fund pot of funding. And we take this conversation on an employer by employer basis. We generally talk about skills development or professional development, and we take our cues from the employer. Remember, the organizational needs assessment and the conversations that take place during the ONA are an opportunity to inform employers, to help them understand the full continuum of skills that may be included under the term literacy, including soft skills. Employers sure understand the need for soft skills, although they may not be familiar with that particular term. An employer might say that employees struggle with following procedures. This could actually be a document use issue. Some employers may note that they want to promote individuals from the floor to supervisory positions, but the employees don't have the skills they need to supervise others. This could be reframed as a soft skills discussion. So if anybody has any examples of skills needs that you've heard from an employer and how you translated that into a literacy skill building opportunity, I welcome you to share that in the chat. Lisa.
Okay, I heard you say welcome to share, but I didn't realize you were going to say in the chat. So I put my hand up before you said that. So I hope it's okay to say that from my discussions with job developers in the employment services world, they have mentioned that employers will say this placement is not going to work out because I have showed this person 10 times how to do this and they just can't get it. And I don't think it's going to work out for us. And I always say to job developers, that is a critical opportunity for LBS to intervene, to really break down the task that can help the person to understand the step-by-step process. So if it's with the cash or if it's like a point of sale machine or a computer or something, an LBS service provider may send someone over to take a look and see what it is they're supposed to know, and then break down the skills and work with the person in order for them to be able to get it. Because I see that as a literacy issue, not an intelligence issue or a motivational issue. I think it's a skill-based issue.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'm glad that you shared that verbally. Out of sheer respect for how quickly you raised your hand, that was awesome. I also feel like employers are going to be more open to having somebody come in and provide this kind of analysis now than they may have been 5 years ago, right? Like say 10 years ago when the labor market looked very different than what it does today, it's highly likely that an employer would not have had the patience to work with employees. But say John shows up every day, that's a feather in John's cap. But that's an employer would want to keep John, right? Because John is consistent. He's somebody that you can depend on. And so I think employers are now starting to realize that it's in their best interest to keep John on and provide a little bit more extra support than just to let him go. Doug, can you share, please?
Thanks. Yeah, I completely agree. We do have to come up with, we do have to discuss the L word. But where I do it is after I've already heard from the employer what their needs are. And then I come back with what we do in LBS and say, oh, did you know that we could do this? And it's specific to a particular need they've identified, as opposed to us going in and saying, here are all the things we can do, and then they have to match it up to their needs. So I'm just suggesting that if we're going to talk about the L word, let's talk about it after we know what the needs are of the employer.
That's a great point, Doug, because it also speaks to not making the employer do anything more than they absolutely have to do, right? Our ability to interpret what we're hearing and then feed it back to an employer takes the guesswork out of it for them, makes it easier for them to say yes or no. And I think they're far more receptive to that kind of interaction. They don't want to do brainstorming. They don't want to, they just want to get on with it by and large. So thank you.
Okay. Before we move on, there were a couple of comments in the chat. So Anne-Marie said, engaging with others is equal to communicating for positive outcomes, working as a team. So that's an example she's heard. And Shelley shared that in our region, the grade 12 requirement has been less important to hiring. They just want reliable workers. So yeah, we're seeing the same in our area, Shelley. Okay. Any other comments before we move on? Okay, paperwork. So I like to think of paperwork as a necessary evil, especially if the training's funded through the ministry. If it has been funded through the ministry, you have to be upfront about the required paperwork and processes you will use to make sure that it's completed. Even if you aren't using ministry funding, there's still going to be paperwork that needs to be put in place. You need to make sure that they know that there are forms the employer will need to sign. So for example, if you're going to do a memorandum of understanding and forms that the employees participating in the training will need to sign. So I think, you have to make sure that they're aware of this, but you also can try to make it as painless as possible. We do this again every day in LBS, where we deal with paperwork and we try to streamline the processes and keep it literally as painless as possible for everybody involved. So for example, during intake, if you're doing intake and you're using ministry funding and you have to fill out participant registration forms, highlight the fields that have to be filled in. That's a quick and dirty streamlining of that form. Not every piece of information on that form is required to set up a service plan in the system. So just highlight those parts that have to be filled in. If you have participants filling in paperwork in a group, walk them through it. Not under the guise that they can't do it, but under the guise that everybody hates this kind of paperwork. It's confusing for everybody. So we're just going to walk you through it to make it as easy as possible. These are strategies we use in our own programs, so they're not really any different. It's possible that you might be able to become aware of people that might struggle with this part of the process through HR. They might have a good idea of who they suspect might have challenges with this type of thing. So if that information is available to you, use it, and then use all the strategies you use in LBS to try to make that as easy as possible for the person having to go through it. If you're, again, using ministry funding and you have to do learner plans, make sure they're populated ahead of time. If you're delivering training, you're probably delivering group training, so they're going to have the same, milestones and activities on their learner plan. So fill it out ahead of time so it's easy peasy. And maybe don't call them learner plans. You might want to call them a training plan. You might want to call them an employee professional development plan. You don't need to, again, don't speak LBS. Try to speak what makes sense within the workplace. And last but not least, if you are using ministry funding, remind people that they're going to be contacted after the training is complete, because we have to follow up with them to make sure that everything is fine. And just keep it as simple as that, but just try to stress that it is important that we're able to follow up with them. So again, it's something that you still need to think about. Especially if you're using ministry funding. If you're doing fee for service, then you can kind of do your own thing, but you are going to have to collect some information. Lisa, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if there was any kind of monitoring that was going to take place after this first phase in this initiative, whether the ministry will contact the organization just to either verify or do their own kind of follow-up. Do you know if that's going to take place?
Okay, so just to clarify, you're talking about the Skills for Success initiative,
Yes.
where you're going to be okay, so I don't know the answer to that, Lisa. The ministry hasn't given us any real information about what that process is going to look like at this point.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay, I thought somebody else had their hand up, but maybe not. Okay. Okay, again, clarifying employer expectations. So I think we've talked about this. It's been peppered through the whole discussion. And it's, again, this isn't necessarily a finite step in the process. It's something that happens throughout the process. Much like when you're doing assessment with a client, you're always going to be going back and clarifying and making sure everybody is on board and understands what's happening. There's no magic wand to completing this process. You don't, and also as you're going through the process, you really want to make sure that you have the information you need. You can't accept vague answers like, we just want to raise skills. You really need to get at the heart of what it is that they're looking for. Employers aren't just expecting to see an increase in skill levels. They're going to want to see something more than that. There's a reason why they're bringing you in to do training. And again, we just can't stress this enough, that this is a process and you really need to keep checking in along the way to make sure you understand what the employer really wants and the employer understands what you can actually offer. So there's just a few points on this slide, like encourage that reality check. We've built in the reality checks into this presentation. You need to build those reality checks into your process as you walk through it. You need to be upfront about things. You need to translate anything that you marketed to them as a promise into an achievable outcome. And don't be afraid to negotiate those outcomes. Don't overpromise what you can deliver. And if you can't deliver something and you know somebody else can, then bring them in, because a partner who can do it is just going to make it a stronger foundation for being able to do this in the future. So I'm going to turn it over to Tamara, and she's going to talk a little bit about this tool that they've developed.
Thanks, Robin. So we've been talking a lot about the initial conversations that happen with an employer. So we're all different, right? Some of us are pretty comfortable with organic, on the fly kind of stuff, and some people like to have more of a process. So we're introducing this conversation guide just as a guide, right? I mean, it's not something that you're probably going to go through step by step by step, but we're introducing it here and hopefully you can see it okay. We tried to make it as readable as possible. But if you get to the end of your conversation with employers and you think, oh my gosh, we didn't talk about, number 4 at all. Then you'll know to go back and address this issue. And what I might do is send this out as a separate document when I send out the slides, just so it's a little bit easier for you to read. But again, it's not the end all be all of how to conduct an ONA. It's just a process that we have put together as a check and balance to make sure that you've addressed a lot of the main topics that we think you're probably going to want to know about as you're moving into gathering information about the ONA. And please keep in mind, in our experience, the organizational needs assessment, it is a pretty organic document and one that is definitely subject to change. Okay. Over to you, Robin.
Okay. So back on our kind of like different things we've identified as pieces of the puzzle, we're going to talk a bit about conducting a gap analysis. So depending on the scope of the training, a gap analysis can be quite comprehensive. However, a full analysis may not be and probably isn't feasible in every situation. So this next little part of the presentation that we're going to walk you through gives you a wide range of analysis that could take place in a perfect world and tools that could be used if you had all the time and money to do it. However, what you are able to do is going to really vary from situation to situation. In some cases, you're really just going to have to rely solely on the information you gather during a meeting or two with management. That's the reality. But what we wanted to present to you was kind of the wide range of things that you could consider as you're going through this process if you have the opportunity to do so. So when you're conducting your gap analysis, and by that I'm really talking about, you know what they need and you need to determine where the gaps are and really fine tune that so you can fill in the gaps with training. What you want to try to keep in mind is that there's 3 different levels that you can look at it from. So you can look at it from that organizational level, from the operational level, and from the individual level. So just keeping that in mind as you go through the process is important. The organizational level gap analysis is kind of that macro level to determine generally what training is needed in the organization. You're looking at the organization as a whole, including the future goals. What skills do employees need now, but also what might they need in the future as the organization grows and changes. Some possible sources of information at this level are likely conversations, as we've talked about. They're kind of interviews, but you look at them more like a conversation with the employer. You might even have an opportunity to do a survey to get a little bit more information and to actually have some additional people in that discussion who maybe can't sit down with you, don't have the time to do that. So you want to ask questions like, where is the training needed most in the organization? What problem is the training addressing? Who's going to benefit from it? Is it the entire organization? Is it a specific group of employees? Is it a specific department that you're focusing on? And also, will training be needed in the future as the organization grows and changes? So again, this is pie in the sky kind of stuff, but always keep it in mind as you're doing this, because you might see opportunities where you can plant seeds for the future. Again, this stage might not even happen hardly at all if the employer already has a really good idea of what they're looking for. But a broader discussion can again lay the foundation for opportunities right now and in the future. When you're looking at the operational level, it's more of a specific inquiry to really find out what kind of training employees need to achieve a required proficiency. So employees do jobs, they do tasks. And if there are challenges in those tasks, we're looking at that kind of more finite. What is it that they're having issues with, or where are the problem areas? You need to actually understand and analyze the tasks employees are performing on the job. And then you need to compare that to the skills and knowledge of the employees to determine those gaps. So it's kind of a, you have to look at the big picture. What does the job really require? And where are the gaps in the skills and knowledge of the employees? So aside from getting this information through conversations, you might also look to job descriptions, performance standards, and also operational problems that have been identified in those discussions you've had. The discussion is also a great opportunity to collect authentic material from the workplace. So when you identify the tasks employees need to do, ask about actual workplace materials that employees engage with. That could be signs, it could be forms, it could be procedures, it could be policies, it might be instructions. There's so many things that people interact with in a work environment. If you can get copies of things like that, or pictures, that's going to help you when you're developing your very specific workplace assessments and curriculum. So I can't stress enough, this is a good opportunity to have this discussion and try to collect these materials. Doug? Oh, Mike, your mic's off.
Well, thanks, Robin, for raising that. That's an excellent point. I really believe that we have the opportunity, LBS going into a workplace where we're not going to be teaching skills in a classroom and then hoping that they'll be able to transfer it to the workplace. We'll actually be able to use real authentic workplace materials to teach the skill. One of the things that I'm working on a workshop right now where teaching the steps of managing a document, for instance. Lots of people have to deal with charts and stuff like that, but not everybody knows how to navigate a document. So I'm developing a workshop right now to have it done by the end of March, and we'll provide that to the province. But I think that if we can teach the steps of getting the answers, or have to teach the steps of doing a task, I think we will be in a really, really good shape, especially when we go into workplaces.
Great. Thanks, Doug. That's really good, good support for that. I think it's important. It's really important, and it's a great opportunity for us to be able to do that. Okay, so at the individual level, you're trying to determine if the employees have the skills they need to meet the performance expectations, and if not, where the gaps are. You could look to performance reviews, although it's unlikely you'd have access to this, or interviews, or possibly surveys with employees. At this level, it's a little more difficult because you're at a personal level and people don't always like to share where they have challenges. We experience this as literacy practitioners and programs every day, and we're really good at doing this as well. It's a skill set that we all have. Doing it in a workplace is definitely going to add a layer of complexity because people, again, people like to, people don't necessarily want to share about those things when they're in a workplace. So I think it's good to think about this, but also remember that you're going to have to use the information you have to develop the training, and maybe dig a little deeper during individual assessments once you're starting or commencing the training, to really fine tune that, where people are in maybe a little bit of a safer environment once they get to know you. So we are going to talk a little bit about individual assessment near the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to go back to, there's a comment in the chat from Sarah. Another important thing to ask, sorry, it just jumped on me. Another important thing to ask is the business culture around accommodation and assistive adaptive devices and apps. Would employers be okay with employees using adaptive apps to assist with their job tasks to be more successful? That's an excellent point, Sarah. Thanks for bringing that up. Really, really, really good point. Okay. So there are many different ways you can approach getting the information you need to do a gap analysis. You're not going to use all the tools, nor would you have the capacity to do so. And the employer is not going to have the patience if you wanted to do all of this. So you have to kind of pick and choose what you think will work. And if you need more information, especially if you need more information than what you can glean just from discussions. So again, this is kind of a pie in the sky. Here are all the things you could consider doing as you're collecting information. But the reality is, on a case-by-case basis, you're not going to be able to do all of this, but just tools to think about. So observation is obviously a big one. So sources could be supervisors' direct observation and input, written work samples, team leads, supervisors, or managers might have been asked to observe employees to determine areas of difficulty. So if you can get this kind of information, it's great. You can use surveys, questionnaires, and self-assessments. The nice thing about that is you don't have to have people kind of captive in a room with you, and you might get some more honest information if things are done, especially anonymously, if you're getting that general information. Depending on the relationship with the employer, you might get access to some data from their HR records. And by that, I don't mean specific individual data, but maybe some general information, accident and safety reports, job descriptions, job competencies, maybe compiled exit interview information, performance evaluation compilations, that type of thing. Again, probably not reality in most situations, but it's something to think about if you have the opportunity. We've talked a lot about interviews and conversations. But just again, keep in mind the three different levels: the organizational level, that macro level, operational level, and then the individual level when you're having these conversations, and how important it is to try to get information at all of those levels. And again, focus groups. Focus groups are kind of an old thing. I think of it. We don't really do them that much anymore, but that could be a great way to ask a whole bunch of people simultaneously the same questions and the information. Sometimes people are comfortable talking in that type of a situation. But again, it might not be the reality on the ground in a workplace. So this great segue into
Okay, I like that I get to do the reality checks, because reality checks give you permission to think about what's actually possible and to cut yourself some slack. Maybe I'm just a slacker, and that's why I like about reality checks. But a lot of these things we've already talked about, but I think they're worth reiterating, right? I mean, we've just spent quite a bit of time talking about tools and resources that you can use. And it sounds like it's probably going to be a 6-month process, right, to conduct an organizational needs assessment. You will not have that kind of time. But again, as Robin said, what we're hoping to do is present a range of things that you can pick and choose from, kind of like a toolkit, right? So you might only do 1 or 2 of those things, and that's okay. And hopefully it'll be an ongoing relationship with an employer, and maybe over time you'll pull in a couple of other tools. And that would be, I think, really useful and good learning and more manageable, right? Than trying to do a full-fledged ONA that requires a significant amount of people power. Just a reminder to manage those expectations along the way. As LBS providers, we can do a lot for employers, but that's not to say that we can or have to stretch ourselves to fill every training need that an employer may have. Better to under promise and over deliver, of course, than to not deliver. And remember, if you can't provide some of the training, perhaps you can put an employer in touch with other community organizations that can. There may be benefit, again, to taking this back to a literacy service planning group and saying, you know what, I can do this, but I can't do this. And maybe another LBS provider can step in, or maybe you have good wraparound referral resources in your community that could fulfill another need. Okay, so just a few things to think about there. And we encourage you to try to think about training and supports from the perspective of the entire organization, not just the 3 different levels that Robin mentioned. There may be discrete needs for different groups, but often one training need for a group can influence another group. For example, you might provide training that supports employees in thinking about their primary learning style. This kind of training will be more effective if supervisors also get training in how employees' learning styles may differ. Raising employee awareness without also raising supervisors' awareness is like only looking at half the puzzle. Or take clear writing as an example. You might suggest applying a clear writing lens to documents in the break room on the bulletin board to increase employee understanding and follow through. Again, in this case, it'd be a good idea not just to fix what's on the bulletin board, but to potentially have whoever is creating these documents learn more about clear writing. While clear writing still supports employees, it'll also support everyone within the organization and promote the idea that communication is only effective if it's understood. So the point here is that once you've identified 1 or more training needs, think about how that need or needs can have a ripple effect.
Okay, so once you've identified the specific problems you need to address, you can match training topics or options to those identified skill gaps. Coming up with areas of training and corresponding outcomes will set up a framework for the training that you eventually or put together. You're going to need to prioritize the training that can be offered, probably in some cases, depending on the scope of need you have identified through the process. So you might find that there's a lot of need at an organization, and you really will need to prioritize what you're going to do first and what makes the most sense. What you perceive, however, as a priority and what the employer sees as a priority is something else that you have to consider, because those could be 2 completely different things. So again, you have to check in with the employer as you're going through this process to make sure that your minds are meeting on this. Some things to consider when you're identifying and prioritizing training options can include: is it going to address the main issues or problems that have been identified? Because that's paramount to what you're doing. Is it cost effective? And I only bring this up as you may be offering this type of training as fee for service, not funded through the ministry. So it has to be also cost effective, where it has to be cost effective for the employer, but in this case also for you. If you're doing fee for service, you have to make sure you're getting paid adequately for what you're providing. And of course, you also have to think about as you're prioritizing things and just determining what the training is there a return on the investment for the employer? This is both in terms of cost and time, because time is money in a company. So even if the training is being delivered at no direct monetary cost to the employer, there's still a cost involved in terms of time, especially if the training's being delivered during work hours. And we heard some comments on this early in those like not successful or not good training experiences where there's often an expectation that training happen. And yes, the employer wants training, but they don't want to pay the employees for their time or invest that money in the employee training time. So that's something to consider in all of this and think about. And that's an expectation reality check with the employer too. You know, how successful is this going to be if employers have to do it on their own time? It's probably going to be a lot more successful if the employer is willing to pay the employees for their time to invest in the employees.
Okay, so we wanted to take a moment and introduce the idea of tandem training delivery. And if you look closely, this is what Robin and I will be doing when we retire from LBS. Okay, we're going to take a tandem bike on the road. So much like in an LBS classroom, you can find that a workplace has employees at varying stage of skills competency. It can be difficult to accommodate all of these needs simultaneously. If other LBS programs exist in your community, and if you have a good relationship with one or more of them, consider what you might be able to achieve together. For example, one of the employers that we're working with, the college is providing higher level instruction, and the community-based program is supporting employees who may be at lower levels, right? So it's all happening, all the training's happening at the same time, but we're respecting the fact that there will be a variety of different skill levels. We're able to bring in 2 of our LBS providers as opposed to just one. And in that way, I think employers are getting the attention that they need and that they deserve. And we're still providing a good service without necessarily separating people out within a company. Okay, so you may not have to do everything by yourself, but maybe you can actually do it together with an agency in your community. So give that some thought, especially if some of you are thinking about applying for workplace delivery pilots. Okay, we have to be realistic about costs. Next, Robin. Okay. So every employer I've spoken with in the last 2 to 3 years has cited soft skills as an important issue within their workplace. So we know that soft skills matter to employers. However, most employers feel at a loss when confronted with soft skills issues among employees or among supervisors. So where and how do we work soft skills into an organizational needs assessment? It definitely comes up in discussions, both preliminary and ongoing with employers. Although again, not all employers will recognize the term soft skills, nor all that it can encompass. You might have to do some prompting and use terms like conflict management, communication, problem solving, time management. So specific examples of soft skills. If you have a need to do assessments with individual employees, you can also work conversations about soft skills into these one-on-one assessments or skills check-ins. And different tools exist that can be used. Literacy Link South Central has one that we developed for the manufacturing sector that focuses on 8 soft skills: organization, adaptability, teamwork, problem solving, dependability, communication, attitude, and how detail oriented people are. And I know that Project Read also has a tool called Learning with Swagger that focuses on soft skills as well. And I'm sure there are others. And it'll be interesting to see if new tools are developed at the federal level through Skills for Success, since there is a greater reliance on soft skills in the new listing of skills. Let's just take a moment to talk about outcomes. So at this point in the O&A process, you've had conversations with the employer and possibly even with others within the organization or company. You've done a gap analysis of some sort and you've identified training options. You've considered soft skills as part of the mix. Now you're getting down to the nitty-gritty of developing programming. A critical part of developing workplace literacy programming, which we'll talk about more in our next webinar, is developing a shared understanding of outcomes. This may sound obvious, but we think it's a great way of closing the loop on the ONA. What we've done at Literacy Link South Central is ask the LBS provider who will be customizing and offering the training to identify specific learning outcomes that will result. This list of outcomes is then shared with the employer. And we ask the employer, is this what you want to get out of the training? Are these the outcomes that are important to you? At the very least, it's a chance to be sure that both the employer and the LBS provider are on the same page. It's also an opportunity to continue to inform the employer as far as literacy goes. Ideally, the outcomes make sense to the employer and reinforce the need for the training and what's expected to happen as a result of the training. The employer may ask for clarification, or they may challenge some outcomes or add some other outcomes that hadn't been considered by the LBS provider. And this practice of clearly establishing outcomes, in my mind, is just good customer service. So this next slide is just designed to give you an example. I know you all know what outcomes are, but this info was actually shared with one of our employers. So we said, you, the employer, said you wanted time management and goal setting training. We think that employees will learn the following. So you can see that under sample learning outcomes. And likewise with professional writing. The hope is that employers can look quickly at the learning outcomes and feel reassured that the training employees will access will meet identified needs. If employers don't think the learning outcomes are appropriate, it's better to find out before you fully design and deliver training than after the training has been delivered. Okay, again, in preparation for the community of practice session in a couple of weeks, we invite you to think about some potential outcomes that you could pitch to employers. For each outcome you identify, ask yourself, is this outcome worded in such a way that someone who doesn't work in LBS would understand what would be learned here? And if the answer is no, then consider rewording your outcome. If employers don't understand what it is you're trying to teach employees, they're certainly not going to want to spend their very limited time working with you on training schedules, logistics, and the like. So here we go again with what I think is our final reality check. While we would suggest you're keeping an eye on your organizational capacity and your scope from the first conversation with an employer, now is the time to review closely. What you commit to needs to be within your organizational capacity, within your scope, adequately resourced. Are you doing this training as part of your core LBS funding, or is the employer paying for the training? It also needs to be inclusive of development time. Studies have shown that the more tailored the curriculum is to the specific workplace, the more learning occurs. The gathering and using authentic workplace documents takes time. If there is funding available, as there may be next year through Skills for Success funding, make sure you ask for funding to tailor curriculum or at least build this cost in. If it doesn't show up as a separate line item, do what we always do and plug it into delivery or do whatever you have to do, right? But the reality is, you need to be gathering and using those workplace documents. So make sure that you don't end up, having to do that off the side of your desk. Okay. So now you have all the information you need, theoretically, to write an ONA report. So the ONA report should be clear and concise. You're not writing an academic paper, you're writing something that will describe your conversation to an employer and to other people that the employer may wish to share it with. So we definitely encourage you to use clear writing principles to develop your report. If you need some training in clear writing, then you could talk to Sarah Gill from Adult Basic Education Association because she has some wonderful training along those lines. Because it's highly possible, although not mandatory, that your ONA or your Organizational Needs Assessment report could form the basis of an agreement or a memorandum of understanding, either between yourself and the employer or between an LBS agency and an employer. So you want to make sure that it includes descriptions of training that you're proposing, who the target audience is, and the rationale for the proposed training. And you can rely on information that you may have gathered during the gap analysis here. An ONA report could also include information about the timing and location of training, like will the training be conducted in-house or externally? Does it make sense to bring a trainer to train several employees on the subject matter rather than send everyone to an offsite training? Does the company have any internal subject matter expertise to help conduct the training? Can or should the training be conducted online? Is there a preferred learning style for participants? And are all participants at one location or multiple locations, or are they decentralized? If there's a cost for the training, you definitely want to include that and outline what the next steps in the process are. So try to be as specific as possible and include timelines because that just helps keep everybody on the same page. So this is just a suggested report outline. I mean, yours might look entirely different, right? You might add elements, you might take some out, but this is just sort of a guide for you to consider. So a little bit about a learning culture. We've talked about this numerous times today. So every employer is different, but the four that Literacy Link South Central is currently working with show a lot of interest in building a learning culture. One of the employers said that they're interested in workplace literacy training because they want their employees to live their best lives. So clearly this employer is not just thinking about building skills for work. They want to support their employees in gaining skills that they'll need for all aspects of their lives. But building a learning culture is a fairly vague term. So how do you actually do that? How do you know if you're progressing along those lines? So in addition to providing training, we've begun to think about, I mean, just at the very beginning stages, but we've begun to think about how recognition for learning will take place. You know, it's one thing to deliver training, but how might you recognize that learning amongst employees? Thinking about reviewing how onboarding of new employees takes place. We talked about the integration of clear writing. This is something I'd love to see. We're definitely not here yet, but working towards building, enhancing, and promoting employer policies related to learning. Sometimes you hear employers say, oh, well, we've got a policy on learning, you know, but half the people in the company don't know about it, right? Or they don't know how to apply for it or how to access it. And finally, sharing messaging about how learning relates to success in life. Employers that become known for having and promoting a learning culture may well become perceived as better places to work. And what we're hearing is that younger generations think a lot about this kind of thing when they're deciding who they want to work for. You know, like there are variances obviously between generations, but younger folks, they're not just looking for the paycheck. I mean, money's important, but they're looking for a different kind of experience or maybe a more nuanced experience out of their work. Okay, so talking to employers about their competitive advantage could be a good way to um, get them a little bit more jazzed about workplace literacy training. Over to you, Robin.
Okay, before we move on with the last part of our presentation, where we're just going to touch on individual, well, most of the last part, individual needs assessments, I just wanted to remind people that if you do need to leave before the end of the webinar, please take the time to fill out the evaluation. Jeremy has posted it in the chat in case you need to access that early before we end the webinar. Thanks. So with we're just going to really spend a few minutes touching on the topic of individual needs assessments. Individual needs assessments happen within that larger organizational needs assessment process. Literacy practitioners do individual needs assessments all the time within their programs. I can't stress this enough. You have the skills to do the work. You just need to transfer them to a different arena, the arena of workplace. So it's something we're familiar with, and I'm going to actually talk about it in terms of the way we think about assessment. So when we think of assessment, we typically identify 3 points or types of assessment: in initial, ongoing, and exit. And these touch points apply to the process of conducting an individual needs assessments within that concept of an organizational needs assessment. Initial assessment is that point where we determine the current skill levels, current skill gaps. And when you are conducting an organizational needs assessment, the employer needs, goals, and wants as well. So although that's more organizational, it is still, in my mind, there's different types of individuals within this process. So based on all that information, you're going to match the learning outcomes you've identified through initial assessment with the training that you actually develop. So that's your pre-assessment piece. The ongoing assessment is going to ensure that the progress is actually being made. It's also the stage where you're continuously evaluating, revising, and modifying what is happening to ensure progress is continuing. Since this is the delivery phase, you also want to build in positive reinforcement to encourage engagement with the participants. So you need to really think about that ongoing piece from an individual assessment point of view. So Feedback is important to the individuals participating in the training on an ongoing basis. You want that feedback to be under the vehicle of positive reinforcement so that people want to continue participating in the training. The exit stage is the culmination of what's been accomplished and should include evidence that the learning outcomes identified have been met and that the employer has experienced a return on the investment in the training. So this is an opportunity to also encourage that lifelong learning piece for both the employer and the employee that Tamara just actually spoke of quite eloquently just prior to me speaking. So these are, again, this isn't a new concept. This isn't a new framework that we're working in. We're all very familiar with this type of individual assessment, that initial, ongoing, and exit assessment. And it lends itself or transfers itself quite nicely to the whole concept of workplace training. So just to reiterate this, as part of this whole process, context really does matter. We've talked about it quite a bit in the second half of the webinar. Authentic materials are really important to incorporate into the training that you develop or modify for a workplace. And throughout the entire process, you should incorporate materials, processes, and tools from the organization that you are working with as much as possible. Pre-packaged training program isn't gonna meet the individual needs that have been identified through the individual needs assessment pieces. It doesn't mean you can't draw from materials that are already developed. Of course you can. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, but you should always look at how you can contextualize the training to those specific needs that have been identified. This is a large part of that value added piece that we as literacy providers can bring to the table with the employer, because we're really good at this. We're really good at meeting individual learner needs. We have the ability to deliver that flexible learner-centered type of training. That's what we do in programs. We do it every day, and that's what you need to do when you're working in a workplace.
So our goal here, as we're finishing up the webinar, is to actually provide you with a sample of an individual assessment, one that we used recently with an employer. And this is not the end all be all of individual assessments. It's one that we put together to address the needs that an employer voiced and to promote training that we plan to offer through the ONA development to individuals. So Jeremy is actually going to share his screen and quickly run through this particular assessment. Well, we actually try to avoid the word assessment because it's a word that packs a lot of punch. As I said, we're using a skills conversation is what we're calling this one. So before you start going through the tool itself, Jeremy, could you share how this particular assessment came to be? So by that, I mean, what was it that the employer wanted that prompted you to develop this particular tool?
Thank you, Tamara. So this skills conversation came about months after we had actually conducted the preliminary portion of our skills or organizational needs assessment back in early September. The employer came to us after we were, they had approved the type of training that we wanted to deliver based on our conversations and said, we've been thinking a lot about this and we think it would be great if you could take a small team, come to our site, and while everybody's in the midst of a shift change, you can talk to anybody who's willing to sit down and have a conversation with you about the skills that they feel they need, not only to be better in their jobs, but also, that will help them in their personal lives. And so, of course, when we heard this, we jumped at the chance because we know that a good organizational needs assessment involves not just conversations with, for example, the human resources department, but also with the employees themselves. And the employer had signaled to us from the beginning that buy-in was really, really important. Like, Tamara and Robin have been talking about, retention is very much on their minds. Creating a very positive, very learner-oriented, learning culture-oriented workplace was a priority. So they just said, we want you to come in and we want you to have a conversation. And so I liked the word conversation. We liked that word because it's very friendly and it was entirely voluntary. They said, we can't tell you for certain how many people are going to show up and talk to you. But what we will do is we will say to our supervisors, we want you to go and have those conversations to set the tone and example for the rest of the staff that while this isn't mandatory, supervisors really are buying into this, and this is not meant to be an invasive process, which again is why we use the word conversation. So I realize time is limited here. I'm just going to scroll down a little bit, give you an overview of what this looked like. So as you can see, there's a bit of a preamble at the beginning, which was there for the small team to use as a means of just getting the conversation going. We wanted to make sure that they understood, staff understood why we were there, that we had been invited in, but that we were very appreciative of the fact that they were taking the time to talk to us. And that, again, the emphasis was on an exchange of information. I remember telling people, look, we want your perspective because we want to know what areas of training are a priority for you. And so the questions for the conversation that I used here were really very much about trying to avoid it feeling like school, where we weren't saying, what's your highest level of education? When were you last in school? It was really a matter about, okay, how did you end up coming to work for this employer? How are you interested, as you can see here, in advancing your career? Or what's the connection you see between your career and professional development training? And then, in most cases, people answered yes to that question. We dug a little bit deeper and said, what skills do you think you will need? How do you feel you'll go about getting them? And the key thing about getting those skills is it was an opportunity for us to talk about how the employer was interested in making it possible for everybody to get additional skills training on site at no charge to them. And then also building that into the workday, because the employer understands and we understand that everybody's busy. They're hardworking, and we know it can be a burden of time and money to go outside of the organization to acquire skills training. So I'll come back briefly to the skills assessments I used in a second here, but we wanted to look at digital skills, where people's digital skills are. So we have an assessment tool for that. Also a learning skills self-assessment where the employees had an opportunity to either take the skill sheet themselves and use it, or have me or one of the other team members read it to them. In most cases, people just said, hey, why don't you read it to us and then we'll provide you with the answers. After that, what we did was we gave them an opportunity to come up with a score that they would give themselves about 3 specific areas: reading, writing, and math. And as you can see here, on a 1 to 5 point scale, because it's nice and clear cut and simple. And then there was an opportunity for them to tell us a bit about why they feel this way, give us their story. And so there were 3 questions about that, as you can see here: math, reading, and then writing. Again, these are designed to be somewhat quantitative, but again, leaning more on the informality here, because I let it be known to the people that we talk to, this is information that will not be shared with the employer. There's an understanding here that this is entirely for your benefit. It provides us with information in terms of how we're going to develop the training. And then also, crucial component, we will write up a report based on this conversation and send it to you for your keeping. Nobody other than you and my agency will see it. And people liked that. They were very receptive to that. And then just a little bit about background here about their own educational experiences. I asked people, did you ever have to work with a resource teacher? Did you ever have an individual education plan? Again, the reason is, if you did and you feel it's relevant now, how can we incorporate that into the training? And as was mentioned by Robin and Tamara, in the tandem model, there is an opportunity for us to bring in our community-based partners to do that one-on-one training in tandem with the kind of group training that an institution like Fanshawe College will provide. And so just as an anecdote about that, I had a couple of people say to me, you know what, I'm dyslexic and I don't want my employer to know that. And I don't want to be in a class with a bunch of other people because I don't want my colleagues to know that. And that provided a great opportunity for us to say, okay, guess what? We're connected with local providers who can work with you offsite free of charge to help you with your reading. And that was received very well. So we ended up doing a number of referrals to one of our community-based partners. And then to wrap this up, asking, have you ever thought of returning to school for any reason? And if so, for what? That encouraged a conversation about, cost, time, where people are in life. And then also we concluded by asking, these are the areas of training that we identified with the employer, or the employer told us were important. How would you rank them? What's most important to you? 1 to 6. And again, as you can see there, why did you put them in this order? And then what I can do is I can show everybody very quickly, because I am mindful of time here, the copies of the skills assessments that we used. So I will show you the learning preferences tool that we used. This was recommended to us actually by one of our community-based partners. And as you can see, there's some reference here to research done by Leo, so to Doug's outfit. And this is an opportunity to look at how people learn. So as you can see, there's a scoring here. If something applies, it applies to the person, it's a 2, sometimes applies 1 and then 0. If it doesn't, I'll just scroll. Forgive me, I'm going to scroll quickly. It gives people an opportunity to rank their skills. And what this looks for is visual. And there's a series of questions for visual. Auditory, same thing. And then kinesthetic, which, as you can imagine, is often very popular when you're working with manufacturers. Oftentimes you have a lot of people who will identify as hands-on learners. And then I would score it and give individuals their score. And then the last one here that I'll share is the digital skills assessment, which was designed to be, pretty clear cut. It's a series of questions, and then the person gets to say yes, no, a little. Can you easily locate, use computer keys or keyboard keys? Yes, no, a little. As we go down, these things gradually become a little bit more difficult, and then we get to a more advanced section at the end, which involves the use of Office software primarily. And the last thing I'll say about this that I thought was very interesting is on the first day we did this, everybody kind of sort of joked about this and said, wow, when was this written? Is this really old? I mean, we use digital stuff all the time. It was a younger cohort of workers. The very next day, we met several people who never use computers for anything. And that really showed us, hey, you know what? You never quite know what to expect in terms of how people are going to respond when it comes to digital skills. And if anybody wants me to, send anything to them, wants copies of these documents to take a look at, I'm very happy to share, and I can certainly put my email into the chat. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. And as Jeremy was saying, this was not a mandatory thing at this particular employer. And the first day, I think 5 people showed up. So we had our team of people there ready to receive because they're also pumped about what we do, right? But then the next day, there were 19 people who showed up, right? So that kind of shows you how, positive messaging can filter through an organization, right? And we considered that part of building a learning culture, right? I mean, we didn't want people to feel ill at ease, but we were really thrilled to see such a great uptake on the second day. Okay, thanks everybody for sticking with us as long as you have. We are almost done. One more question for the community of practice that will be upcoming. How do you measure the success of workplace training programs? Workplace training programs can absolutely be about learning discrete skills that employees will apply in the workplace, but there will maybe other things worth measuring. And if you're going to measure it, you need to build it explicitly into program design and delivery. And if you're going to design and deliver it, there should be a connection between it and the organizational needs assessment report or results. So that's kind of how we're tying everything together here. So now is our question time, right? So maybe, Robin, could you just advance to the next couple slides just so that we cover them, and then people who don't have questions who may wish to move on with their day can do so. So this is a recap of the 4 questions. I will be sending these out with the invitation to the community of practice. Okay, and I really hope that you'll join us for that, because there are a lot of good reasons to continue our learning together. You heard a lot from Robin and I today, but I know you all have a lot to bring to the table as well. Okay, so one more prompt to do the survey. You can't click on it on the screen, but you can access it via the chat, and we would really, really value your feedback. The community of practice meeting will be November 22nd from 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm estimating until about 11:30. Okay, so thanks so much, everybody, for taking time out of your busy day to join us. Now, are there any questions? Dun, 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 dun. What time is it? Wow, it's 11:59, but we're willing to stay later, right? It's not like you have to fit it all into the next minute. Go ahead, Shelley.
Just something that we've talked about in the past as well. So I know the ministry and is looking at us doing more workplace, and it's really exciting for all of us. When we come into these training opportunities, what do we do when we're in like we're going against private trainers? Because we know all around our community there's lots and lots of private trainers. So how do we differentiate and get that level of professionalism? Because that's what I'm a little concerned on. How do we reach that level of saying we can do this when somebody else is coming in with flashy folders and professional slick
Well,
presentations or something?
that's a really good question. I mean, one of the questions for the community of practice is what makes LBS unique? Like, what's our value proposition, right? So we'll definitely be talking about that more in the community of practice. And I think as far as the how do you compete with the slicker, more flashier outfits that are out there, maybe we need to raise our game. You know, we're a little homegrown sometimes in LBS out of necessity. But, you know, maybe that's a message that we need to be sending back to our funder, right? Is that, you know, we can't do everything on a shoestring. You know, we want to come across as professional and, you know, really having our game well honed, right? So, and maybe that's something, Shelley, I'm not making a promise on behalf of all my colleagues right now, but it's something for us to consider, you know, from a literacy service planning perspective is, you know, maybe there are things that we can do more cost effectively together than do individually, right? So perhaps combining forces would make a lot of sense there. So hopefully that helps. Does anybody else have an answer for Shelley? Anything else you'd like to share? Anne-Marie, I'm not sure if this is in response to Shelley or a different question.
It is. It's in response to Shelley.
Okay.
This is something that we've given lots of thought to because when you're having conversations with employers, you're quite aware that they're inundated with proposals for training and people coming with their flashy, brochures and all those kinds of things. And for me, and I think when we've thought about this in office, is our value is the basic skills part. Is that, when people provide canned training, they're not contextualizing it within the workplace. So we can actually take documents from the workplace and make training about that. I don't know anybody else that does that. And we focus on skills, just those kinds of basic skills. And I know that that's really needed when the employer starts thinking about it. And I really think it's our time to shine around that. And nobody can compete with us on that because we've done this for decades. So I think that there is a place for us. It's just a matter of learning how to talk about that in a meaningful way to employers.
Wonderful.
I'm
Thank
also hoping, Shelley, that word of mouth is strong everywhere, not just in information referral stats for LBS, right? I mean, we always joke about that, how word of mouth is always our strongest way of getting referrals. That's a good thing, right? When people are happy with the service that you have provided and they talk to other people about it, I mean, it might even be a case of be careful what you wish for. Right? I mean, if a lot of people started knocking on your doors saying, I'm ready, come and deliver some workplace literacy training, that's something we'll all have to keep an eye on, right? Is capacity as employers continue to struggle with finding people and retaining people, they will be much more open to hearing from agencies like ours, I think.
Well, and I think another thing also is they've in the past been able to be very selective, and now they really can't. Like some of them are, as we said, don't need the grade 12 anymore. Are you breathing? And, can you show up for work? That's what we're getting to. And so that training, the onboarding can be very expensive for them. So you can see that retention is critical now, where before it wasn't really a problem.
And that's a great angle, Shelley, because one of the employers we're working with right now said, I used to be able to hang out a shingle and hire semi-skilled people, and I can't do that anymore, right? Which means they're bringing people in who have gaps in their skills, and employers are starting to realize this. And that's one of the reasons why they wanted to be a part of our particular project, why they felt the timing was right for them.
That quote needs to go in a report of some kind.
We'll definitely make note of that.
All right. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you. Any other questions? Doug.
Not so much a question, but a comment. the workplace that I'm working with not only wants us to come in and support the employees in their workplace environment, but they also want them to gain skills so that they can live more comfortably in their own community. So sometimes when we're looking for workplace employers who will sort of have a similar philosophy to us in LBS, sometimes we may want to be looking at those. The other thing is I really, really enjoyed the whole idea that both Tamara and Robin presented today around the transferability of us taking our little kit bag of LBS tools and all the goodies and taking it into a workplace. It's not a big leap. We can do it. I know we can do it. And my last comment is, Tamara and Robin, what a wonderful, wonderful presentation. You guys were fabulous today. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thanks, Doug. And, it's no secret that a lot of what we presented, I mean, it's not my experience, it's not Robin's experience, it's a combined experience of a lot of you. A lot of what we've heard from you over the years, a lot of what you've shared with us that we were able to build in today. So it's been a pleasure and an honor to be able to, do whatever we can do to try to raise the capacity of folks in our field to do this kind of work. So thanks, Doug. Okay, any other comments? I mean, if you don't have any other comments or questions, then you're welcome to go on and do the other 9,000 things on your list of things to do. After you complete the evaluation, please and thanks. And again, Robin and I will hang out here until we're lonely loners and you're all done. So thanks.